I'm going to talk a little bit first before getting into some of what I'm doing with the research of Inside Out, kind of about how I became involved in Inside Out and why I think Inside Out is an important movement, I guess you could say, even though it's called a program. I have always in academia taken classes into prisons. However, I have always been very careful and considerate about making sure that those visits are not what I refer to as zoo tours. And the way in which I do that is that I make sure that I've already established relations. My history, I wasn't always in academia. I worked in the system for a while, and so I've always had relations where I could go out, talk to where we were going with the folks we were going to visit, and have facilitated dialogue, mostly always around issues of social justice and equality, around race, gender, crime, and justice. And so we would have these facilitated conversations with folks who were incarcerated, as well as people who work in the system. And at one point, I was talking to one of my liaisons at the prison, and these always go very well, and they're very invigorating, and everybody wants to keep talking, and of course count happens, and we have to get out of there. And I said, it'd be great, to have this class, and I'm thinking about this. And I get this invitation by email, which are all on tons of different listservs, to go to an Inside Out regional conference. And I'm reading about it, and I'm thinking to myself, as all egomaniacs in academia do, they stole my idea 15 years earlier. And so I go to it, and I was very moved. Actually, I called my good friend Michael over there and said, oh my gosh, I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this. So him and I attended the training last May, which was a week-long in Philadelphia, which is a national training program where you're basically doing the pedagogy and being trained the pedagogy of Inside Out at the same time. So you essentially are a student in the course of the training and working really heavily with the think tank for the National Inside Out program, which is a group of men at Griffith Prison who are all serving natural life sentences, who are very, very integral to the program. So I taught my first class, we're fast forwarding now, I had my first class in the fall, and in my department, I'm in a sociology department, even though my training is in justice studies, and some of my very esteemed colleagues said, what do you mean, you're teaching a corrections class in a prison? Isn't that an oxymoron? And I said, well, no, wait a minute, you're making all kinds of assumptions about what this is, because we know kind of what we know about correctional education, which has typically been in the U.S. vocational-based programming, and of course, only with folks who are incarcerated. Inside Out as a model is very different. Let me get into some of the kind of logistics. So Lori Pompa, who's the founder of the National Inside Out program, but as you'll see in the newsletter, the entire idea is attributed to a man named Paul, who is part still of the Greater for Think Tank. And it was the same kind of thing that happened on one of her prison tours where Paul was at. He actually said to her, wouldn't it be great to have a semester long of these very stimulating conversations? To date, they've had over 200 trainings, or 200 instructors trained, and this isn't just in the U.S., there are folks getting trained abroad. In fact, we have some Canadian friends here who we were talking at lunch, and I know that they came in August, I think, to the training, and they're talking about instituting the program in their entire federal system. We have people in Australia who are trained, and also the French delegation has been out and is interested in the program as well. And just some basic statistics about 7,500 students to date. Now, a lot of folks think, oh, is this just criminal justice? Actually, there's a range of disciplines. Of course, predominantly, folks who are teaching the class tend to be in criminal justice or criminology disciplines. But there are lots of folks, for instance, in the humanities teaching classes. I still haven't figured out how this gentleman in Colorado does this because of the need for a lab in a prison, but he even teaches a biology class in the prison. So there's lots of different disciplines represented, as well as different types of facilities or prison facilities, from minimum security to supermax security to community-based facilities where the classes occur. Just to give a brief, very brief, history of kind of higher education and the correctional systems in the U.S., in the early 90s, the repeal of the Penal Act made it very difficult, right, for folks to get access to higher education because they basically stated that, people who are incarcerated are no longer eligible for these grants. And so even though, by the way, in spite of the fact that there was no law-abiding college students ever denied a Pell Grant because of a prisoner participation in the program. Interestingly, though, if you start looking from that time, and Pell Grants, by the way, have not been reinstituted in the States, if you look at that time, there's been other types of block grant initiatives to try to get some money into higher education, but it's been very selective. So the Incarcerated Youthful Offender Act put money in for folks who are under the age of 25, less than 5 years out. They have to have a GED, they can actually get some of the federal funds for college classes in the prison. But if you start looking at the data, it starts looking at that as if the same percentage of folks who are being educated in terms of higher education in the prison is, by 2005, the same numbers were present. But there's been a huge shift in the fact that it's mostly vocational-based training. So community colleges going in and doing mostly horticulture or skill-based training classes. And of course, the difference with higher education in terms of inside out versus what we saw previously is that those classes, inside out classes, do not only include incarcerated students. We bring in university students as well. I'm not going to get into these statistics. I'm going to talk about a little bit about my class specifically at a prison in Ohio, in Lancaster, Ohio, which is about 45 minutes from the campus. So typically college classes that are inside out based have 15 university students and 15 incarcerated students. In my first class, I had 10 university students and 8 incarcerated students, primarily because what happened is I had a program in which the prison first wanted to pilot the program out of, which was called a camp. And it's the only camp in the state of Ohio that they call a reentry camp. And so it's basically for any man in the state who's eligible to come to the program 90 days pre-release, they go to this camp if there's room. And I had recruited all of my students from that camp where they wanted the class to take place, and 2 weeks before the quarter started, they shut the camp down because of budget cuts. So, which was probably in some ways a really good thing, in other ways not such a good thing. So then I had to come inside the prison and recruit, and it was this fast-paced, let's give everybody in the honor storm and see if they're interested in taking it, because I don't just say you're taking the class. I do a presentation, and then if they're interested, they do kind of an application process. The same exact process the university students go through. They can't just register for the class either. We do have a strict set of, depending on the institution you're in, institutional rules. The university students have to go through, of course, background checks. However, I've always had students in my university classes and in this class who have felony records. It's hard not to anymore, right, in the U.S. In Ohio, actually 1 in 25 Ohioans have a felony record. And so it's not a matter of whether they have a felony or not in terms of whether they can come in. The only time they've excluded any of my students is if they know somebody at that particular institution, not even if they know somebody in the state of Ohio. But they do the background checks to say that they've done them in a way that characterizes us as volunteers or interns, since we're coming in there every week for 2.5 to 3 hours to hold class. We also have a semi-anonymity rule. So we sit, by the way, in a weekly course meeting, always in a circle. From the first class, we sit every other seat, inside student, outside student, to start trying to break down the barriers of the us versus them, and to kind of get into the context of what we're doing. We're not there to study the folks who are actually incarcerated. We're there to study issues together. And the semi-anonymity is based on a couple of factors, which that means everybody chooses a name and create these name badges like we all have. It can be a nickname or your first name, but there's a no contact rule within the program after the course ends. So, and there's a few reasons for that, some of which I may not agree with philosophically, and most of you probably may not agree with philosophically, but what the anonymity, the semi-anonymity does, though, is it actually makes everybody, to be honest, much more comfortable from the beginning, because the university students are quite nervous, obviously, about going into the classroom and who they're going to be interacting with, and because they've just been exposed to reading about the big bad CJ system and all the big bad people that we incarcerate in the CJ system, right?